In the armory depths of Strike Cruiser Lamentable, Brother Sergeant Voss draws his combat blade across the fresh bone spurs erupting from his knuckles. The ceramic edge scrapes against calcium growths that should not exist, producing a sound like grinding teeth. Each stroke follows the rhythm of the litany of concealment, words he has spoken 10,000 times. Let my flesh serve though it rebels. Let my form hold though it changes. Let my duty stand though I am damned. The bone dust falls like snow onto his scarred gauntlets, mixing with sacred oils until it forms a paste he will later use to anoint his bolter's machine spirit. 3 sectors away, in the belly of transport vessel, Penitent's March, Trooper Caney checks the purple contamination tattoos covering his left arm for the morning's color shift. The bioreactive ink has darkened 2 shades since yesterday, indicating his exposure to chaos corruption during the Mordian campaign continues its measured progression. He traces the administrative barcode burned into his wrist, designation 4471 Omega-7, the same numerical sequence that appears on his deployment orders, his ration chits, and his expected casualty projection. Around him, 43 other marked soldiers perform identical morning inspections, their tattoos displaying the spectrum of Imperial damnation: Gene Stealer Purple, Chaos Crimson, Psychic Silver, and the rare black of multiple contaminations. These are the Imperium's cursed soldiers, and they number in the millions across 10,000 worlds. They are not anomalies born of desperation or bureaucratic oversight. They are systematic components of Imperial survival, weapons the state needs but cannot acknowledge, assets whose very existence contradicts the purity doctrines that define Imperial identity. The official records classify them separately, maintaining the fiction of distinction where none exists in practice. Brother Sergeant Voss belongs to the genetic aberrants, descendants of the 21st founding, whose gene seed carries experimental modifications that manifest as physical mutations. Trooper Caney represents the contaminated Imperial Guard survivors whose exposure to heretical forces has rendered them tactically valuable but spiritually suspect. Different origins, different administrative departments, different theological justifications for their existence. Yet both receive identical deployment parameters: maximum tactical utility, minimal strategic investment, acceptable total loss. The Departamento Munitorum processes both categories through parallel bureaucratic channels that converge at the same terminal point. Genetic aberrants fall under Directive S21, established in 738.M41, to manage variant phenotype assets with strategic applications. Contaminated forces operate under Protocol Omega, implemented 3 years later to optimize deployment of compromised personnel in specialized combat roles. The administrative language differs, but the mathematics remain constant. Both programs maintain an 85% gene seed reclamation quota for Space Marines and project identical 73% casualty rates for Guard formations within 6 months of deployment. Brother Sergeant Voss completes his morning ritual by pressing his thumb to a cracked Aquila badge welded to his armor's breastplate. The Imperial Eagle bears a fracture line running from crown to talon, a damage pattern that appears on similar badges carried by cursed soldiers across 100 war zones. No regulation permits this modification, yet no commissar has ordered its removal. The badge serves as an unofficial talisman passed between the dying and the damned, its significance understood without explanation. In the Penitent's March, Trooper Caney performs an identical gesture, touching a matching cracked Aquila pinned inside his flak jacket. He received it from a Black Dragon Space Marine bleeding out in the Sabbat World's trench, who whispered only, "Pass it on," before his dual hearts finally stopped. The badge carries no blessing, no sacred inscription, no promise of redemption. It simply acknowledges what the Imperium cannot, that some soldiers serve not despite their damnation, but because of it. The morning briefings arrive simultaneously across both vessels. Brother Sergeant Voss receives deployment orders for Hive Tertius, where gene stealer infiltration requires specialists with aberrant genetic resistance. Trooper Caney's unit draws assignment to the same theatre, tasked with contamination reconnaissance in compromised urban zones. Different justifications, identical coordinates, overlapping operational timeframes. The administrative codes match. 4-1 Omega-7 appears on both sets of orders, a numerical sequence that appears in classified deployment rosters from Armageddon to the Maelstrom Zone. This convergence reveals the hidden architecture of Imperial strategy. Across the galaxy, genetic aberrants and contaminated soldiers receive deployment assignments that cluster around specific threat types, their various curses deployed like specialized ammunition against enemies that conventional forces cannot effectively engage. The Imperium has learned to weaponize its own damnation, turning genetic instability and spiritual contamination into tactical advantages while maintaining the fiction that such soldiers serve as penance rather than policy. Brother Sergeant Voss sheathes his blade and begins the day's equipment checks. Trooper Caney secures his contamination monitoring gear and reviews his squad's tactical assignments. Neither questions why their separate paths lead to the same destination, why their different curses serve identical purposes, or why the Imperium that denies their worth continues to depend upon their sacrifice. They are the marked and the damned, and they are exactly what the galaxy requires. The convergence at Hive Tertius emerges from bureaucratic machinery that operates with mathematical precision across the Imperium's vast administrative apparatus. The same cogitator banks that generate Brother Sergeant Voss's deployment orders simultaneously process Trooper Caney's contamination assessments, their different curses flowing through parallel channels that converge at identical terminal points. This is not coincidence but systematic design, the product of classification systems that organize human damnation with the same methodical thoroughness applied to munitions inventories and supply requisitions. The Departamento Munitorum's classification index, Hereticus, divides cursed soldiers into 7 primary categories, each subdivided into operational classifications that reduce spiritual corruption to administrative convenience. Category Alpha encompasses genetic aberrants, descendants of the cursed, founding, whose gene seed modifications manifest as quantifiable deviations. The Black Dragon's osteoblades receive designation VPCD, annotated as Ritual Mitigation Viable, Combat Utility High, Concealment Mandatory. The Lamenter's statistical misfortune falls under VPCE, classified as Stochastic Deviation with Tactical Applications. Each aberration earns its own administrative code, casualty projection, and deployment matrix. Category Beta covers contamination cases, with exposure indices ranging from E0 for minor corruption to E7 for soldiers whose continued existence defies theological explanation. Trooper Caney's Chaos exposure rates E3 classification, significant contamination with manageable progression and tactical utility in hostile zones. Genestealer Taint receives Beta Purple designation. Psychic Scarring falls under Beta Silver, while the rare Beta Black classification marks soldiers who survive multiple heretical exposures simultaneously. Categories: Gamma through Epsilon catalog increasingly exotic forms of damnation, Xenos symbiosis, temporal displacement, Necron scarring, Tyrannid adaptation syndrome. The system's elaborate complexity serves dual administrative purposes. It provides the bureaucratic framework necessary to manage millions of cursed soldiers across 10,000 worlds while maintaining the comforting fiction that each curse type represents a separate phenomenon requiring different theological justification and tactical handling. Yet beneath this taxonomic sophistication lies a different reality. Despite their elaborate classifications, genetic aberrants and contamination cases receive identical administrative treatment, once processed through the system. Both undergo the same psychological evaluations using Form 7741 PSI. Both receive equipment modifications following Technical Manual 88 variant. Both face deployment restrictions governed by the same casualty tolerance algorithms. The Apothecarian's 85% gene seed reclamation quota applies equally to genetic aberrants and contaminated space marines, while guard formations of both curse types project identical 73% casualty rates within 6 months of deployment. This administrative convergence reflects the Departamento Munitorum's cost-benefit analysis for utilizing damaged assets. Internal memoranda, classified at Vermilion clearance, reveal the economic logic driving cursed soldier deployment. A Black Dragon Space Marine costs 40% more to equip than standard Astartes due to specialized weapon modifications and medical monitoring, but demonstrates 180% greater effectiveness in void-boarding actions against Chaos vessels. Contaminated guard units require minimal additional training to operate in environments that would devastate standard formations, reducing logistical overhead by 60% while maintaining equivalent tactical performance. These calculations drive adaptive deployment protocols, algorithmic systems that match curse types to tactical requirements with mathematical precision. When Genstealer infiltration threatens an Imperial world, the protocols automatically generate deployment orders for Beta Purple contaminated units and any available VPC-class genetic aberrants with demonstrated Xenos resistance. Chaos incursions trigger identical deployment matrices for Beta Crimson formations and genetically modified chapters with enhanced spiritual resilience. The system treats different curses as interchangeable tactical assets, their origins mattering less than their operational utility against specific threats. The protocols explain apparent anomalies in deployment patterns that would otherwise suggest Imperial favoritism or persecution. The 47th Mordian Penal, bearing E4 contamination from Sabbat world's exposure, demonstrates 90% survival rates in anti-chaos operations compared to 30% for standard formations. Their contamination grants partial immunity to corruption effects that devastate conventional forces, transforming spiritual damnation into tactical advantage. Similarly, the Lamenters receive preferential assignment to operations requiring noble sacrifice, not as punishment, but as optimal deployment for their specific curse type. Their statistical unluck serves as a tactical asset in scenarios where conventional success metrics fail. The shared experience of systematic expendability creates cultural convergence among cursed soldiers, despite their different origins. Genetic aberrants develop ritual concealment practices, filing bone growths and painting aberrant flesh to maintain machine-compatible appearances. Contaminated soldiers perform morning color checks and breath litanies, monitoring their spiritual degradation while maintaining operational readiness. Both curse types end their days with identical audit procedures, equipment inventories and soul scrubs that reduce their existence to administrative data points. More significantly, both develop parallel coping mechanisms that transcend their classification differences. They exchange contraband hymns on scratched data slates, refuse veteran privileges that might draw unwanted attention, and create informal networks for sharing survival strategies. The cracked Aquila badge moves between genetic aberrants and contaminated soldiers because the institution has already made them neighbors in function, if not in name. Across the Munitorum's archives, marginal notes appear that no clerk will claim authorship of. Asset demonstrates interference resilience. Unit tolerates bleed through 5 minutes longer than projected. Chapter accepts attrition without request for indemnity. These annotations reveal how the classification systems are converging in practice. Trial notes from genetic aberrant programs and contamination tables from exposure protocols now share notation systems, weighting algorithms, and data repositories. What began as parallel administrative channels increasingly back one another's operational conclusions. This convergence raises questions that the classification systems cannot answer through taxonomic complexity alone. Why do certain contaminated units repeatedly defy casualty projections, while specific genetic aberrant chapters receive disproportionate shares of Category E missions, where valor becomes indistinguishable from planned attrition? The adaptive deployment protocols learn from each engagement, but their learning follows patterns that suggest deeper connections between genetic trials and contamination management than official doctrine acknowledges. The answer lies not in the elaborate distinctions between curse types, but in the hidden logic that determines which curses serve strategic purposes and which require immediate elimination. That logic operates beyond the reach of classification systems in the spaces where bureaucratic efficiency meets strategic necessity and where the Imperium's need for specialized weapons overcomes its commitment to doctrinal purity. The administrative convergence that now routes both genetic aberrants and contaminated soldiers through identical deployment matrices did not emerge from bureaucratic coincidence, but from the calculated desperation of late M41 when attrition outpaced orthodoxy across the Imperium's military apparatus. The crisis manifested in stark mathematical terms. Gene seed banks entered negative growth trajectories by 737.M41, with annual losses exceeding replacement capacity by margins that threatened the Astartes program's fundamental viability. Simultaneously, Eastern fringe campaigns against Tyranid splinter fleets revealed conventional Space Marine tactics' inadequacy against adaptive Xenos biology, while Chaos incursions demonstrated similar limitations against corruption-based warfare. These converging pressures forced the High Lords of Terror to authorize extraordinary measures couched in ordinary language. Directive S21 emerged from sealed sessions whose minutes remain classified at Obsidian clearance, formally designated the Adaptive Phenotype Development Protocol and authorized by unanimous decree on 738.M41. The directive's clinical terminology masked radical departure from established gene seed doctrine. Variant zygote conditioning described experimental modifications to Space Marine genetic templates. Supplementary endocrine scaffolds referred to hormone therapy designed to accelerate aberrant development. Accelerated phenotypic expression meant forcing genetic changes that would normally require millennia to manifest safely. The 21st founding launched with 13 chapters created through S21 protocols, each designed to address specific strategic inadequacies identified by Fabricator General Lucas Chrome's analysis of Imperial military capacity gaps. The Black Dragons received osteo-weapon modifications intended to provide enhanced close-quarters capability against heavily armored Xenos. The Minotaurs underwent aggression enhancement to counter Chaos psychological warfare. The Lamenters carried stochastic deviation genes designed to create tactically useful unpredictability in scenarios where conventional planning failed, yet the clinical language concealed costs measured in bodies rather than data points. Osteogenic amplification expressed as extruded bone blades erupting through flesh in patterns that followed no anatomical logic, requiring constant maintenance to prevent skeletal system collapse. Pyrogenic episodes, described in medical reports as enhanced metabolic response to stress stimuli, manifested as Space Marines spontaneously combusting during combat, their enhanced physiology consuming itself in pursuit of tactical advantage. Statistical unluck translated to ammunition failures, equipment malfunctions, and transport delays that killed battle brothers with mechanical precision. These aberrations were not failures of S21 protocols, but their intended outcomes. Internal Mechanicus documentation reveals each chapter's genetic modifications included acceptable casualty ranges, with projected attrition rates calculated into operational deployment matrices from inception. The Black Dragon's osteoweapons carried a 40% chance of skeletal system failure within 5 years of activation. The Lamenter's statistical unluck was calibrated to produce 60% higher casualty rates than baseline chapters while maintaining tactical effectiveness through enhanced resilience training. This calculated approach to acceptable losses established the administrative framework governing cursed soldiers across the Imperium. The 85% gene seed reclamation quota emerged not from medical necessity but from cost-benefit analysis determining optimal return on genetic investment before aberrant chapters became too damaged for strategic deployment. Triage followed quotas, not mercy. Apothecaries carried extraction rights alongside combat stims, their auspex calibrated for organ harvest windows as much as enemy movement. Fire plans shifted to match reclamation probability. Push the aberrant squad into the manufactorum where blast overpressure is lethal but leaves the chest intact. Avoid high-flame munitions near brothers whose progenoids are due for harvest. Administrative codes hardened these practices into policy. Chapters flagged by S21's variance registers received secondary classification, EASU, expendable asset, with strategic utility. Under that designation, mission selection changed character. Boarding actions against warp-touched hulks, hold-the-line orders on doomed agri-worlds, diversions designed to bleed enemy timetables rather than achieve objectives. The euphemism Category E tasking replaced suicide mission in official documentation, but the mathematics remained identical. Within the administratum, the same cost models that governed genetic experimentation began examining contaminated forces. If variant phenotypes could be tolerated for their tactical returns, could tainted guardsmen be managed through identical frameworks? The bureaucratic machinery that processed genetic aberrants proved adaptable to contamination cases. Magos Biologis Verincult supervised genetic modification protocols for the Black Dragons, while simultaneously developing contamination assessment procedures for guard units exposed to tyrannid bioweapons. His research notes demonstrating methodological overlap that suggests deliberate convergence rather than administrative coincidence. Protocol Omega drafted contamination indices 5 years after S21's variance bans, but the forms appear related because they are. The decision trees mirror each other precisely. If phenotype deviation exceeds 22% but efficacy rises above 160%, retain under concealment and restrictive rights. If exposure index reaches E4, but interference resilience increases by 2 grades, deploy in hostile zones with commissarial oversight. Cull only when reclamation or containment fails. Replace gene seed graphs with contagion vectors, and the policy reads identically. The administrative code that now binds Brother Sergeant Voss's orders to Trooper Kane's deployment parameters descends directly from these convergent protocols. 4471 Omega 7 represents more than numerical sequence. It encodes the bureaucratic logic that treats genetic instability and spiritual corruption as interchangeable tactical assets. The same personnel who authorized deliberate genetic aberrations also developed frameworks for weaponizing contamination, creating parallel systems for managing different types of useful damnation. The evidence points toward a conclusion that challenges official imperial doctrine. The genetic aberrations were not unfortunate side effects of necessary experimentation, but calculated risks priced into strategic planning from inception. The 21st founding represents the Imperium's first systematic attempt to create cursed soldiers through deliberate design rather than operational accident, establishing administrative infrastructure that currently processes millions of cursed soldiers across 10,000 worlds. Whether contamination protocols mirror genetic aberrant management through coincidence or design becomes the critical question. The bureaucratic machinery suggests the latter, revealing how the same institutional logic that greenlit genetic trials also developed frameworks for managing spiritual corruption. The convergence was not accidental but inevitable, the product of an empire that learned to weaponize its own damnation with mathematical precision. The bureaucratic machinery that transformed genetic aberration into strategic asset through S21 protocols found its contamination counterpart in the crucible of necessity, where Imperial Guard units became cursed not through deliberate design, but through contact with the very enemies they were deployed to destroy. Yet what began as emergency triage for the spiritually wounded evolved into systematic policy with mathematical precision, revealing how the same institutional logic that greenlit genetic trials also developed frameworks for weaponizing accidental damnation. The Hadron incident of 739-41 provided the template for contamination management protocols. When Chaos cultists breached containment at a plasma refinery complex, 3 regiments of Mordian Iron Guard found themselves trapped in warp-saturated industrial zones for 47 days. Standard doctrine demanded immediate execution for any guard exposed to E2-level corruption. Yet the 712 survivors who emerged from the cooling tunnels bore E4 contamination indices while maintaining tactical coherence that defied theological explanation. Colonel Commissar Vex's after-action report documented phenomena that challenged established doctrine. Soldiers, whose minds bore chaos scarring, showed enhanced resistance to subsequent psychic attacks, their spiritual wounds serving as crude immunization against further corruption. The Sabbath Worlds campaign systematized these discoveries through exposure protocols that mirrored S21's variance management. General orders required contamination cordons after any engagement involving warp phenomena, with wounded receiving bioreactive tattoos that tracked exposure progression through color-coded indices. Those marked entered contamination companies, whose administrative processing followed templates borrowed directly from genetic aberrant management. Form 7741 Psychological Evaluations, Technical Manual 88 Variant Equipment Modifications, and deployment matrices optimized for hostile zones where conventional forces suffered catastrophic attrition. The 47th Mordian Penal became the proving ground for contamination deployment doctrine. Their chaos exposure during the Sabbat campaigns granted what Departamento Monitorum reports termed interference resilience, the capacity to maintain unit cohesion in corruption-dense environments that shattered standard formations within minutes. Where uncontaminated regiments suffered 80% casualties from warp exposure in first contact, the 47th maintained 60% operational strength through 6 months of continuous deployment against demonic incursions. Their contamination served as tactical vaccination, spiritual corruption providing resistance to further corruption in patterns that challenged imperial purity doctrine while proving strategically invaluable. Alongside battlefield adaptation came deliberate experimentation. Classified facilities at 3 quarantine forts housed controlled corruption chambers where condemned penal troops underwent managed exposures to measured warp phenomena. Null dampeners and hexagrammic wards maintained exposure below possession thresholds, while subjecting volunteers to bleed through effects calibrated for specific outcomes. The stated purpose was acclimatization training, but casualty logs revealed different objectives, creating soldiers whose damnation granted tactical advantages against similar threats. Results proved inconsistent but economically viable. Controlled chaos exposure produced Beta Crimson soldiers with demonstrated demon resistance. Managed Genestealer contamination created Beta Purple formations, whose altered pheromonal responses provided uncanny accuracy in detecting infiltration vectors. Psychic scarring experiments yielded Beta Silver veterans who maintained formation coherence during warp storms that left conventional units catatonic. The mathematics were brutal but clear. Contaminated assets cost 60% less to maintain while demonstrating 180% greater effectiveness in corruption-dense environments. These experiments birthed Project Anathema in 741M41, initially classified as limited research examining contaminated soldier effectiveness against matched threats. Internal memoranda reveal broader scope, systematic deployment of cursed soldiers as specialized weapons against enemies that conventional forces could not effectively engage. Anathema protocols created the first formal framework for curse immunity deployment, matching contamination types to tactical requirements with algorithmic precision. The administrative convergence between genetic aberrants and contaminated forces became total under Anathema management. Both curse types underwent identical psychological evaluations, equipment modifications, and medical monitoring procedures. Deployment matrices used unified algorithms treating genetic deviation and contamination indices as interchangeable variables. Most significantly, both received EASU classification, expendable asset with strategic utility, indicating administrative merger at the highest bureaucratic levels. This convergence extended beyond paperwork into operational reality. Contaminated soldiers developed ritual purification procedures that paralleled genetic aberrants' concealment practices. Morning contamination checks mirrored bone filing ceremonies, both curse types monitoring their deviation through identical administrative frameworks. The cracked Aquila badge passed between genetic aberrants and contaminated soldiers because the institution had already made them functionally equivalent in purpose, if not in origin. Evidence increasingly suggests contamination events follow patterns too consistent for coincidence. Deployment orders placing uncontaminated units in measured corruption zones, medical teams positioned for assessment rather than evacuation, administrative processing beginning before contamination events conclude. The bureaucratic machinery indicates the Imperium has learned to create cursed soldiers through controlled exposure as systematically as through genetic modification, treating spiritual corruption and genetic instability as different methodologies producing identical tactical assets. The question becomes not whether contamination is always accidental, but how extensively the Imperium has integrated controlled corruption into strategic planning. Project Anathema's classification parameters suggest an enterprise spanning multiple segmenta, coordinating cursed soldier deployment with mathematical precision that treats human damnation as renewable resource rather than theological catastrophe. The emergence of Project Anathema as systematic policy required more than administrative efficiency. It demanded theological justification that could reconcile imperial purity doctrine with the deliberate deployment of cursed soldiers across 10,000 worlds. The ecclesiarchy provided this justification through parallel doctrinal developments that transformed different forms of damnation into unified frameworks of service, sacrifice, and surveillance. Cardinal Voss's Treatise on Inherited Corruption, published in 742-41, established the theological architecture that now governs both genetic aberrants and contaminated forces through identical spiritual mechanisms disguised as separate creeds. For genetic aberrants, the doctrine frames their mutations as inherited sin, requiring lifelong penance. The Black Dragon's osteoblades represent physical manifestation of genetic pride, their flesh rebelling against the Emperor's perfect design through ancestral hubris. Each morning's bone filing becomes an act of contrition, their pain serving as payment against debt they did not incur but are condemned to bear. The lamenter's statistical unluck transforms into divine punishment for their gene line's experimental origins, their misfortune serving as perpetual reminder of humanity's fallibility before imperial perfection. Brother Sergeant Voss recites the litany of concealment not as personal choice but as theological requirement, his words binding him to service through acknowledgement of inherited corruption. Contaminated soldiers receive parallel theological treatment through the doctrine of purification through sacrifice. Their exposure to heretical forces marks them as spiritually wounded but not spiritually dead, their contamination serving as test of faith rather than proof of damnation. Trooper Caney's chaos scarring becomes evidence of his struggle against corruption, his survival demonstrating Imperial resolve in the face of darkness. Each deployment into hostile zones offers opportunity for spiritual cleansing through service, their contamination gradually purged through acts of valor against similar threats. The 47th Mordian Penal's enhanced demon resistance transforms from tactical advantage into theological necessity, their immunity earned through suffering rather than granted through blessing. These parallel justifications converge on identical practical requirements, administered through unified bureaucratic frameworks. Both curse types undergo mandatory screening procedures using parallel administrative forms. Genetic aberrants submit to monthly gene screenings recorded on Form 8841 VAR, while contaminated soldiers receive bioreactive tattoo assessments documented on Form 8841 CON. The forms share database architecture, processing algorithms, and reporting structures because they serve identical functions despite theological distinctions. Auspex arrays calibrated for variance detection operate alongside contamination monitors in the same medical bays, their readings processed by the same cogitator banks and transmitted to the same oversight departments. Control mechanisms extend beyond medical monitoring into comprehensive lifestyle regulation designed to maintain operational effectiveness while preventing deviation beyond useful parameters. Ritual calendars restrict both curse types through identical scheduling limitations that minimize their exposure to orthodox imperial ceremonies. Genetic aberrants may not participate in victory celebrations where their mutations might be observed, instead attending modified rites conducted in sealed chambers with reduced ceremonial requirements. Contaminated soldiers face parallel restrictions, their presence deemed spiritually hazardous during major observances but acceptable during penitential services where their contamination serves as object lesson rather than theological contamination. Equipment modifications serve dual purposes of concealment and control through standardized procedures documented in Technical Manual 88 variant. Genetic aberrants receive modified power armor with reinforced joints to accommodate bone growth and internal dampening fields to suppress aberrant emanations. Contaminated soldiers wear specialized gear incorporating hexagrammic wards and biomonitors that track contamination progression while preventing spread to uncontaminated personnel. Both modifications require identical maintenance protocols and replacement schedules, their technical specifications sharing component libraries and repair procedures that indicate unified design philosophy rather than separate development programs. The survival taxes extracted from cursed formations operate as systematic policy rather than administrative neglect. Their deprivations calculated to maintain operational effectiveness while demonstrating theological subordination. Resupply arrives 40% behind schedule for cursed units through deliberate logistics planning, forcing them to operate with reduced ammunition and equipment reserves that increase casualty rates while maintaining combat capability through enhanced training and resource conservation. Transport delays isolate cursed formations during critical operational windows by design, requiring them to hold positions longer and advance with reduced support compared to orthodox units. These delays serve dual administrative purposes. They reduce Imperial investment in expendable assets while providing theological justification for their enhanced suffering. Elevated tithe requirements drain cursed formations of personnel and resources through administrative mechanisms that appear routine but compound into significant operational burdens. Genetic aberrant chapters face enhanced gene seed tithes exceeding standard apothecarian requirements by 30%, forcing them to maintain higher casualty tolerance to meet reclamation quotas while providing the Imperium with increased biological resources for further experimentation. Contaminated guard regiments contribute additional personnel to penal formations and quarantine duties, their effective strength reduced through administrative transfers that masquerade as routine rotation while actually feeding the system that created them. These survival taxes serve the Ordo's unified cull protocols, administrative frameworks that determine when cursed soldiers transition from strategic asset to elimination target through identical mathematical assessments. Both genetic aberrants and contaminated forces face the same threshold measurements. When deviation exceeds acceptable variance parameters, when contamination progresses beyond containment indices, when unit cohesion degrades below operational minimums, when loyalty assessments suggest heretical drift. The Ordo Hereticus and Ordo Malleus operate these protocols through shared personnel and procedures because the administrative logic treats different forms of damnation as variable inputs rather than distinct phenomena requiring separate oversight. The administrative efficiency of managing both curse types through identical bureaucratic channels reveals the system's underlying unity. Personnel trained in genetic aberrant management transfer seamlessly to contamination oversight because the procedures are functionally equivalent. Equipment manufactured for one curse type serves both through minor specification adjustments, database architecture processes genetic deviation, and contamination indices through unified algorithms that reduce theological distinctions to administrative variables. The cracked Aquila badge passes between genetic aberrants and contaminated soldiers because the institution has already made them neighbors in function regardless of their origins in faith. This convergence transforms permanent suspicion from theological position into operational doctrine that governs every aspect of cursed soldier existence. Surveillance becomes sacrament through daily monitoring requirements that track deviation not for spiritual guidance but for tactical deployment optimization. Confessors rotate squads through assessment interviews at intervals calculated to maintain psychological stability while gathering intelligence on unit cohesion and loyalty indices. Officers learn to communicate in measurable pieties, replacing trust with tolerance metrics and fraternity with compliance monitoring. The theological language remains, but its center of gravity shifts onto calculus that makes permanent suspicion not a moral stance but operational necessity. The doctrine's success depends upon cursed soldiers accepting their damnation as punishment requiring redemption rather than recognizing it as tactical advantage conferring strategic value. Yet extended service under unified control mechanisms creates shared experiences that transcend original curse types. Genetic aberrants and contaminated soldiers develop parallel coping strategies, informal networks, and cultural practices that suggest growing awareness of their systematic exploitation. When Brother Sergeant Voss files his bone spurs while Trooper Kane checks his contamination tattoos, both perform identical rituals of concealment that serve the same institutional requirements despite different theological justifications. The critical question emerges when cursed soldiers begin viewing their damnation as evolution rather than punishment. If genetic instability and contamination grant tactical advantages that Orthodox forces lack, if their systematic deployment reveals imperial dependence rather than imperial mercy, if their curses provide capabilities essential to imperial survival, then the theological justifications collapse into revealed hypocrisy. The Black Dragons, whose bone endures decades without collapse, speak quietly of blessed form. Beta Crimson veterans who maintain formation under demonic influence call themselves hardened rather than tainted. These shifts in perspective challenge the fundamental premise that cursed soldiers serve as penance rather than policy. When permanent suspicion becomes the only language between soldiers and masters, when surveillance replaces trust as the foundation of military organization. When cursed soldiers recognize their strategic value exceeds their theological burden, the doctrine faces its ultimate test. The system now runs on distrust because distrust produces reliable tactical returns, but that same distrust may eventually produce organized resistance from forces the Imperium cannot afford to eliminate, but cannot allow to remain independent. The question becomes not whether cursed soldiers will recognize their evolution from punishment to strategic necessity, but how the Imperium will respond when its most effective weapons begin to see their damnation as their greatest strength. The theological frameworks that govern cursed soldier management achieve their most refined and cynical expression through the Lamenters chapter, where statistical unluck has been transformed into the Imperium's most reliable mechanism for noble sacrifice. Their curse manifests not through visible mutation, like the Black Dragon's bone spurs, or spiritual contamination like Trooper Kane's chaos scarring, but through mathematical precision that makes Brother Sergeant Voss's morning ritual of concealment seem almost fortunate by comparison. The Lamenters represent the perfection of useful damnation, their misfortunes so systematically exploited that their nobility has become an administrative asset managed through the same bureaucratic machinery that processes genetic aberrants and contaminated soldiers. The arithmetic of misfortune operates with mechanical reliability across every aspect of Lamenter's operations. On Iphigenia Secundus, a manufactorum moon beneath encroaching Tyrannid bioships, they received orders to extract 36,000 workers from collapsing hab stacks while maintaining defensive perimeters against Xenos advance forces. The mission parameters followed templates identical to those governing contaminated guard deployment: maximum tactical utility, minimal strategic investment, acceptable total loss. Reinforcements from the Mordian Fourth arrived 41 hours behind schedule, citing fuel constraints that mysteriously resolved the moment evacuation zones cleared. Munitorum supply convoys delivered 10mm ammunition for 12mm bolters, forcing improvised solutions that increased casualty rates while maintaining operational effectiveness. Vox channels suffered selective interference that isolated Lamenter's communications while leaving Allied frequencies clear. These failures are not administrative oversight, but calculated policy implemented through the same deployment matrices that govern other cursed formations. Form 77741 PSI psychological evaluations rate the Lamenter's morale stability at exceptional levels despite systematic deprivation, their gene lines stoic conditioning making them ideal candidates for resource-constrained operations where other chapters would break or rebel. Technical Manual 88 variant equipment modifications include enhanced recycling systems and improvised munitions protocols designed specifically for formations operating under deliberate scarcity. Their EASU classification ensures they receive assignments where material disadvantage becomes tactical necessity rather than operational failure. The chapter has learned to plan for systematic betrayal with methodical precision that mirrors contaminated soldiers' morning rituals. Every operation begins with a supply table column labeled expected failure, calculating shortfall percentages that have remained consistent across 2 centuries of deployment. Ammunition bandoliers are modified so one slot in 5 carries different caliber rounds, preparing for the inevitable supply mismatches. Equipment scales are tested by hand because mechanical measurements prove unreliable at critical moments. Tactical waypoints are marked twice then abandoned, forcing navigation by landmarks that cannot be corrupted by administrative interference. When void storms delay relief fleets or fuel shortages strand support vessels, Lamenter's sergeants do not curse their luck, but adjust their casualty projections with the same clinical precision Brother Sergeant Voss applies to filing his bone growths. Their tactical doctrine has evolved to weaponize misfortune through systematic emphasis on civilian rescue operations that generate maximum casualties while achieving strategic objectives the Imperium requires but cannot officially acknowledge. The template was established during the Badab War: deploy the Lamenters where civilian populations require evacuation under fire, their nobility compelling them to accept attrition rates that would shatter other chapters, while their unluck ensures those rates remain consistently elevated. Each refugee saved becomes evidence of Imperial mercy, each battle brother lost becomes proof of noble sacrifice, each impossible mission completed becomes justification for the next impossible assignment. This feedback loop operates through administrative mechanisms that treat mercy as measurable output rather than moral choice. After-action reports quantify civilian casualties prevented, infrastructure preserved, and enemy morale degraded through Lamenter's intervention using the same metrics applied to contaminated guard formations. These numbers feed directly into deployment algorithms that identify scenarios where noble sacrifice provides greater strategic value than conventional victory. The mathematics are brutal but precise. One Lamenter's company accepting 70% casualties to evacuate 10,000 civilians generates more strategic benefit than 3 standard companies achieving tactical objectives with 20% losses. The cracked Aquila badge that appears throughout cursed soldier formations found its way to the Lamenters during the Corinth Crusade when Sergeant Thaddeus pulled a child from burning rubble seconds before a plasma reactor explosion claimed his life. The refugee, evacuated to safety aboard the last transport, carried the badge to her new home in Hive Quintus, where it now rests in an improvised shrine within her hab block. She does not know the badge represents systematic exploitation of noble instincts, that Thaddeus died not from tactical necessity but from calculated misfortune that delayed his extraction by exactly the margin required to ensure his death while preserving the child's life. The shrine serves dual purposes. It provides spiritual comfort to the saved while generating propaganda value that justifies continued Lamenters deployment in similar scenarios. The Lamenters' penance crusades operate as perpetual motion machines of noble suffering, designed to be endless because the imperial bureaucracy requires their particular brand of doomed heroism as renewable resource, rather than finite asset. Each crusade's objectives are calibrated to remain achievable through maximum sacrifice, their parameters adjusted through the same administrative mechanisms that manage genetic aberrant and contaminated soldier deployment. Victory conditions shift as completion approaches, new objectives emerge from bureaucratic review, and success metrics evolve to maintain permanent penance status regardless of battlefield achievements. Internal Munitorum memoranda reveal the systematic nature. Penance crusade extended in recognition of exemplary conduct. The phrase converts virtue into duration, their nobility justifying their expendability, while their expendability proves their nobility. Statistical analysis reveals the Lamenter's curse operates with mathematical precision that defies coincidence. Equipment failure rates exceed sector averages by exactly 8%, a margin sufficient to create tactical disadvantage without triggering equipment replacement protocols. Vox timestamps drift by seconds at critical moments, producing missed coordination windows that isolate them from fire support. Locator beacons burn out during operations at rates that correlate directly with enemy response times, forcing extended exposure that maximizes casualties while maintaining mission completion statistics. These numbers propagate into adaptive deployment protocols, reinforcing assignment patterns that expect them to succeed without support while accepting losses that would be considered catastrophic for orthodox chapters. The administrative convergence with other cursed formations extends beyond logistics into cultural management. Despite their different curse origins, the Lamenters develop identical coping mechanisms as contaminated soldiers, mourning equipment inspections that assume failure, afternoon prayers for supply deliveries that may never arrive, evening maintenance of improvised gear using techniques borrowed from penal formations. They exchange survival strategies with cursed guard regiments during joint operations, their experiences of systematic disadvantage creating bonds that transcend theological distinctions between genetic aberration and contamination. The same cracked Aquila badge passes between lamenters, battle brothers, and contaminated troopers because the institution has already made them neighbors in function, regardless of their origins in faith or genetics. Most significantly, the lamenters serve as emotional anchor for the entire cursed soldier system, their nobility providing moral justification for policies that would otherwise appear as systematic exploitation. When genetic aberrants question their treatment, administrators point to the lamenters' willing acceptance of hardship. When contaminated soldiers resist deployment orders, commissars invoke the lamenters' example of service through suffering. Their curse becomes the system's conscience, their nobility, the proof that cursed soldiers serve through choice rather than coercion. Their willingness to die for others, the evidence that the Imperium retains moral purpose despite its calculated cruelties. Yet this emotional manipulation reveals the system's fundamental vulnerability and raises questions that threaten the entire framework of useful damnation. The lamenters maintain hope through belief that their suffering serves higher purpose, that their sacrifices protect innocence, that their nobility matters more than their tactical utility. When Brother Captain Malachim reviews casualty reports showing 400% higher attrition than baseline chapters, he finds meaning in civilians saved and enemies defeated, rather than questioning why his brothers consistently receive assignments designed to maximize both outcomes through maximum bloodshed. The critical question emerges when acts of mercy become indistinguishable from operational assets in imperial planning. If the lamenter's nobility generates measurable strategic value, if their willingness to die for others serves administrative rather than moral purposes, if their hope itself becomes weaponized against them through deployment algorithms that exploit their virtues for tactical advantage, then their curse transcends statistical unluck to encompass systematic betrayal of their highest ideals. The shrine in Hive Quintus represents both the system's success and its potential failure. The saved refugee maintains faith in imperial nobility through the lamenter's sacrifice, but she also preserves evidence of that sacrifice in forms that could eventually reveal its calculated nature. The cracked Aquila badge serves as talisman for both the saved and the damned, its fracture line marking the space between noble intention and administrative exploitation. When cursed soldiers begin to recognize that their hope has become their chains, that their nobility serves others' agendas rather than their own values, that their willingness to die for others is measured in spreadsheets rather than remembered in prayers, the entire system of useful damnation faces its ultimate test. Are acts of mercy operational assets or the last remnants of imperial humanity? The system treats them as the former, quantifying their effect on compliance indices and recruitment rates, while the people make the memories preserved in improvised shrines and passed down badges. How do you maintain hope when hope itself is weaponized against you? The lamenter's answer reveals the paradox at the heart of cursed soldier existence. Hope survives not as anticipation, but as practice. Rescue the next family, hold the next position, pass the next badge. When the arithmetic of misfortune becomes indistinguishable from the arithmetic of exploitation, survival itself becomes an act of resistance against a system that requires noble hearts to fuel its calculated cruelties. The lamenter's noble suffering provides moral justification for cursed soldier deployment, but the system's operational core reveals itself through formations whose damnation grants direct tactical advantages rather than emotional inspiration. The Black Dragons chapter and the Mordian 13th Penal Regiment demonstrate how genetic aberration and contamination converge on identical strategic applications despite their radically different origins, their parallel development exposing the bureaucratic machinery that treats various forms of damnation as interchangeable tactical assets processed through unified administrative frameworks. Brother Sergeant Voss's morning bone-filing ritual finds its contaminated counterpart in the Mordian 13th's purification ceremonies, where soldiers perform identical maintenance procedures despite their different curses. The Black Dragon's osteoblades emerge from genetic modification, hyper-keratinized bone spurs erupting from forearms, elbows, and cranial plates through enhanced osteogenic processes that transform their skeletons into living weapons. These natural blades require daily grinding to prevent skeletal overgrowth that would lock joints within hours, their enhanced bone density creating tactical advantages that demand constant maintenance. The ceramic edge scrapes against calcium growths with a sound like grinding teeth, producing bone dust that drifts across the armory deck like bitter snow. Across the sector, Trooper Caney and the Mordian 13th perform parallel procedures with their chaos-touched crystalline growths, mineral formations that sprout from contaminated flesh through warp exposure during the Hadron incident. These corrupted protrusions require similar filing to prevent interference with equipment interfaces, their jagged edges producing mineral powder through the same grinding motions that mark the Black Dragon's daily routine. Both formations begin each day with the sound of ceramic blades against aberrant bone, their different curses demanding identical maintenance through procedures documented in Technical Manual 88 variant. The tactical convergence extends beyond maintenance into specialized combat applications that reveal the system's underlying unity. Both formations excel at void-boarding operations where conventional forces suffer catastrophic casualties, their curses providing advantages that transform liability into strategic asset. The Black Dragon's bone blades serve as backup weapons during extended void actions, their skeletal modifications providing close-quarters capability that requires no resupply beyond daily filing. When ammunition runs low in the cramped corridors of corrupted vessels, their osteo-weapons punch through bulkheads and enemy flesh with horrifying efficiency, turning their genetic curse into tactical salvation. The Mordian 13th's chaos scarring grants complementary advantages through resistance to warp phenomena that saturate corrupted vessels. Their contamination serves as immunization against spiritual attacks that incapacitate orthodox troops within minutes of exposure, their scarred minds navigating corruption-dense environments with unnatural ease. Where standard formations suffer 80% casualties from psychic assault during first contact, the 13th maintains 60% operational strength through extended deployment in warp-saturated zones, their damnation providing the very resistance needed to complete missions that would devastate conventional forces. These parallel advantages generate identical deployment patterns managed through unified administrative channels despite different theological justifications. Both formations receive EASU classification with specialized annotations for void warfare and corruption-dense environments, their different curses processed through the same cogitator banks using algorithms that treat genetic modification and spiritual contamination as variable inputs requiring equivalent logistical support. Equipment requisitions follow parallel specifications: modified power armor with reinforced joint assemblies for bone blade accommodation, enhanced environmental sealing for contamination containment, specialized maintenance kits containing ceramic files, and sacred oils for aberrant flesh care. The convergence manifests most clearly through their ritual practices, where genetic aberration and contamination produce remarkably similar spiritual responses to shared institutional treatment. Black Dragon's veterans gather in circles before boarding actions, filing bone spurs down to regulation length while reciting maintenance litanies that blend technical procedure with theological necessity. The bone dust collects in sanctified containers mixed with blessed machine oils to create a pale paste that serves dual purposes: equipment lubrication for weapon systems and spiritual comfort during purification rites. The mixture smells clean and bitter like hot lime on wet stone, its gritty texture providing tactile reminder of their altered nature. The Mordian 13th performs identical procedures with their filed contamination crystals, the chaos-touched growths producing mineral powder that combines with sacred oils through the same proportions and procedures learned during joint operations. Tech adepts supervise both rituals, their blessing recorded in maintenance logs with the notation, "as above, so below." Different ingredients serving identical functions through shared administrative requirements. Veterans from both formations apply the mixture to bolter mechanisms and gauntlet joints during evening maintenance, their different curses producing functionally identical spiritual practices that transcend theological distinctions. Joint operations reveal the systematic nature of their convergence through coordinated deployment that treats them as complementary components of the same tactical system. During the breach of Relic Freighter Canticle of Ash, the Black Dragons entered through melted cargo umbilicals, their bone blades punching purchase into warped frames as they moved hand over hand through corrupted passages. The Mordians breached through clamp locks that reeked of Promethium and old prayers, their formation advancing with shields locked against warp phenomena that would have shattered orthodox units. Inside the vessel, lighting strobed and air tasted like broken reducers, but both formations maintained operational coherence through curse-granted advantages that complemented each other with mathematical precision. The administrative prejudice they face operates independently of curse origin, affecting both formations through identical bureaucratic mechanisms that treat genetic aberration and contamination as equivalent security risks. Orthodox Imperial forces maintain the same distances from both formations, their suspicion based on EA-SU classification rather than specific curse types. Dockmasters post quarantine lines 2 bays out for both units, supply ships misroute ammunition 2 calibers off through the same logistical errors, and Medici rotate every 40 days to prevent over-familiarization with either curse type. Neither formation protests these systematic disadvantages. They adapt through parallel survival strategies that include removable blade caps for inspections, concealed ward inscriptions, and shared superstitions about the pale paste that makes steel run smoother and breath come steadier. Equipment tells the deeper story of institutional convergence through standardized modifications that serve both curse types despite their different origins. Black Dragons wear split-plate gauntlets that accommodate osteo-blade eruption while maintaining armor integrity, their mag boot treads carrying serrated talons for anchoring on oil-slick decks. The Mordian 13th straps hexagrammically warded shields to forearms already tattooed with contamination indices, their shotguns loaded with man-stoppers and blessed salt for anti-demon work. Both carry breach packs heavier than regulation and learn to move like water through decks designed to trap them, their different curses requiring identical tactical adaptations for void warfare. The bone dust mixed with sacred oils becomes the physical manifestation of this systematic convergence, a substance that serves identical functions across different curse types while maintaining the theological fiction of separate treatment. When Black Dragons apply the mixture to their bolter actions during maintenance rituals, the calcium powder provides lubrication, while the sacred oils sanctify their aberrant modifications through chemical processes that treat genetic deviation as manageable variants rather than theological catastrophe. The Mordian 13th's identical procedure using contamination crystal powder produces the same practical and spiritual results, reducing theological distinctions to molecular interactions that serve unified administrative purposes. Post-operation analysis reveals deliberate coordination through shared tactical doctrine that transcends curse distinctions. Both formations use Identical breach-and-clear procedures adapted for aberrant physiology, their different curses requiring similar modifications to standard Imperial tactics. Communication protocols employ the same coded language for reporting curse-related equipment failures. Casualty evacuation follows identical triage priorities that value tactical capability over theological purity, and cross-training programs enable Black Dragon's veterans to instruct Mordian squads in close-quarters techniques, while contaminated soldiers teach genetic aberrants about operating in corruption-dense environments. The evidence points towards systematic design rather than administrative coincidence, revealing how the Imperial bureaucracy has learned to create functionally identical tactical assets through different methodologies. Personnel files document equipment standardization programs, producing identical gear specifications for both curse types through unified procurement channels. Training manuals share tactical doctrine sections applicable to either formation with minimal modification, and deployment matrices treat genetic aberrants and contaminated forces as interchangeable variables in algorithmic systems that match curse types to tactical requirements with mathematical precision. When different curses produce such similar tactical roles and unit cultures, when genetic aberration and contamination require identical administrative treatment despite their different origins, when bone dust from different sources serves the same spiritual and practical functions through the same ritual procedures, the connection becomes clear. Imperial strategic thinking has evolved beyond theological distinctions to embrace pragmatic recognition that useful damnation can be produced through multiple methodologies, their different origins mattering less than their shared capacity to operate in environments where conventional forces fail. The Black Dragon's osteoblades and the Mordian 13th's chaos scarring represent different production processes for the same strategic outcome: expendable specialists whose curses provide tactical advantages that justify their systematic exploitation through unified frameworks designed to maximize utility while minimizing cost. The system has learned to weaponize genetic instability and spiritual contamination as alternative sources of the same tactical capability, treating both as controlled deviation from orthodox humanity that serves identical strategic functions regardless of theological justification. The cracked Aquila badge passes between both formations because the institution has already made them neighbors in function if not in name, their shared experience of systematic expendability creating bonds that transcend the administrative fiction of separate curse classifications. When Brother Sergeant Voss files his bone spurs while Trooper Caney grinds his contamination crystals, both perform identical rituals of concealment that serve the same institutional requirements despite different theological frameworks. Their convergence reveals the hidden logic connecting genetic trials to contamination protocols. Both represent the Imperium's systematic attempt to create cursed soldiers whose damnation provides strategic value, their different methodologies converging on identical tactical outcomes that reduce human suffering to administrative variables in the grand equation of total war. Why do different curses produce such similar tactical roles and unit cultures? Because the system designed them to serve identical functions through different production methodologies, their convergence revealing calculated policy rather than bureaucratic coincidence. What connects genetic aberration to contamination in Imperial strategic thinking? The recognition that both represent controlled deviation from orthodox humanity, their different origins serving as alternative sources of the same tactical capability that the Imperium requires but cannot officially acknowledge. The bone dust mixed with sacred oils becomes the physical proof of this convergence, where different forms of useful damnation meet in shared practice that serves unified administrative purposes disguised as separate theological traditions. The convergence of cursed formations at Baphomet Gate began with administrative precision that concealed its experimental nature behind the familiar language of crisis response. The quarantine lattice surrounding the plague-strewn forge world groaned under systematic assault from chaos forces, its hexagrammic pylons flickering like dying candles as reactor feeds failed and servitor maintenance crews collapsed mid-ritual. Standard Imperial doctrine demanded immediate exterminatus protocols, yet deployment orders bypassed orbital bombardment in favor of ground intervention using specialized assets whose convergence violated every established segregation protocol. The Lamenters arrived under penance orders that followed their established pattern of noble expendability, their strike cruiser emerging from warp translation 47 hours behind schedule with statistical precision that no longer surprised their navigators. Brother Captain Malakim reviewed casualty projections showing 400% higher attrition than baseline chapters, while Brother Sergeant Voss filed his bone spurs in preparation for void-boarding duties that would place his squad in direct proximity to contaminated guard formations. Their orders carried Administrative Code 44-1 Omega-7, the same numerical sequence that appeared on parallel deployment directives issued simultaneously across the sector. The Black Dragons received void-boarding permissions through identical administrative channels, their osteoblades deemed essential for close-quarters combat in environments where conventional weapons faced systematic failure. Technical Manual 88 variant specifications ensured their modified power armor would interface seamlessly with contaminated soldier equipment through standardized connection protocols that suggested unified design philosophy rather than separate development programs. The bone dust mixed with sacred oils filled their maintenance kits alongside hexagrammic ward materials identical to those issued to beta-class contaminated formations. Trooper Caney and the Mordian 13th Penal drew assignment to contamination reconnaissance in corruption-dense urban zones, their chaos scarring providing immunity to spiritual attacks that would devastate orthodox formations within minutes of exposure. Their bioreactive tattoos glowed crimson with E4 contamination indices while their deployment maps overlapped precisely with genetic aberrant operational zones through coordination that appeared routine but violated established doctrine regarding cursed soldier segregation. Additional cursed formations arrived through parallel channels: Flame Falcons with pyrogenic episode protocols, Beta Silver psychic scarring veterans from multiple regiments, each carrying identical administrative codes and equipment specifications. The battle commenced with tactical synergies that revealed systematic integration despite official separation protocols. Vox logs recovered post-engagement document-coordinated communications using coded language that bypassed command channels while maintaining operational security. Pale Mixture Holding Steady reported both genetic aberrants and contaminated soldiers using identical terminology for their bone dust and sacred oil maintenance rituals. Variants within acceptable parameters appeared in transmissions from formations with different curse origins using unified classification systems that treated various damnations as interchangeable tactical variables. Combat effectiveness exceeded projected parameters through curse interactions that transformed individual limitations into combined arms advantages. Black Dragon's bone blades punched through demon-touched bulkheads while Mordian veterans provided covering fire in corruption-dense environments, their chaos scarring granting resistance to warp phenomena that incapacitated orthodox support troops. Lamenter's statistical unluck created diversionary equipment failures that drew enemy attention, while Flame Falcon's pyrogenic episodes provided area denial through controlled combustion that cleared defensive positions with horrifying efficiency. The convergence reached critical mass when multiple curse types operated in direct proximity without the theological contamination that doctrine predicted would result from such interaction. Genetic aberrants and contaminated soldiers shared ammunition, medical supplies, and tactical intelligence through informal networks that transcended administrative distinctions between curse classifications. The cracked Aquila badge passed between formations as both tactical identifier and spiritual talisman, its fracture line marking the space between official segregation and operational necessity. At the crisis point where conventional forces would have broken under combined demonic assault and environmental corruption, Legion of the Damned apparitions materialized with timing that suggested coordination rather than divine intervention. These spectral space marines appeared at precise tactical junctures where cursed formations required additional firepower, their intervention following patterns that indicated systematic deployment rather than spontaneous manifestation. Post-battle analysis revealed their appearance coincided with specific tactical markers that had been pre-positioned by cursed formation reconnaissance teams through procedures documented in classified addenda to Technical Manual 88 variant. The battle's conclusion preserved maximum cursed soldier assets while achieving strategic objectives through acceptable losses calculated to provide experimental data on multi-curse tactical integration. Apothecaries followed enhanced gene seed reclamation protocols that applied 85% recovery quotas equally to genetic aberrants and contaminated space marines, their triage decisions driven by administrative requirements rather than medical necessity. Casualty processing used unified forms that reduced theological distinctions to administrative variables processed through the same cogitator banks and transmitted to identical oversight departments. Post-battle administrative processing revealed the systematic orchestration through documentation that violated standard operational security protocols. Inquisitor Vex's sealed data vault contained deployment matrices showing coordinated timing for all cursed formations, tactical doctrine modifications enabling cross-curse cooperation, and casualty projections that had calculated acceptable losses for each curse type through unified algorithms. The data vault's classification at Obsidian clearance indicated Project Anathema's true scope, systematic deployment of cursed soldiers as specialized weapons against enemies that conventional forces could not effectively engage. Internal memoranda detailed observation procedures embedded within all participating formations, measuring tactical performance, curse interaction effects, and psychological degradation rates through systematic data collection that treated human suffering as experimental variables. The project's stated objective was creating anti-chaos forces from the Imperium's own damned, using genetic aberrants and contaminated soldiers interchangeably based on tactical requirements rather than curse origin or theological justification. The revelation recontextualized every previous deployment as component of systematic experimentation rather than desperate measure, exposing how the imperial bureaucracy had learned to create tactical opportunities requiring cursed soldier deployment through calculated orchestration. The Lamenter's statistical unluck, the Black Dragon's genetic modifications, the Mordian 13th's chaos, scarring, all represented data points in comprehensive research examining optimal deployment of human damnation as renewable strategic asset. Brother Sergeant Voss's morning bone-filing ritual and Trooper Caney's contamination monitoring served identical functions within experimental framework that measured deviation tolerance, tactical effectiveness, and psychological resilience through systematic observation. The cracked Aquila badge represented more than informal talisman. It served as cultural marker for monitoring cross-curse unit development under systematic exploitation disguised as emergency response. Baphomet Gate proved that different forms of useful damnation could be deployed together without theological contamination. That genetic aberration and spiritual corruption served complementary tactical functions through unified command structures, and that cursed soldiers represented strategic assets whose various origins mattered less than their shared capacity to operate where conventional forces failed. The battle became laboratory for curse interaction because it was designed as laboratory from inception, its crisis response facade concealing systematic experimentation that treated various forms of human damnation as interchangeable variables in the grand equation of total war. The convergence marked the transition from individual curse management to systematic multi-curse deployment, revealing how Imperial strategic thinking had evolved beyond theological distinctions to embrace pragmatic recognition that useful damnation could be produced through multiple methodologies and deployed through unified frameworks that maximize tactical utility while minimizing administrative overhead. The sealed data vault provided definitive proof. Baphomet Gate was controlled experiment disguised as crisis response, its coordination revealing systematic policy that transformed cursed soldiers from theological burden into strategic necessity through calculated exploitation of their various damnations. The sealed data vault from Baphomet Gate contained more than deployment matrices and casualty projections. It revealed the complete operational architecture of Project Anathema, exposing systematic observation protocols that had transformed every cursed soldier into an unwitting research subject whose suffering generated data points in the Imperium's most classified strategic program. The documentation proved that genetic aberrants and contaminated soldiers served not as theological burdens requiring management, but as experimental assets whose effectiveness was measured, optimized, and systematically exploited through unified frameworks that reduced human damnation to administrative variables. Observation protocols operated through embedded personnel whose primary mission was data collection disguised as routine support functions. Medicae assigned to both genetic aberrant chapters and contaminated guard regiments carried enhanced Auspex arrays, calibrated to measure deviation progression, tactical performance, and psychological stability through identical procedures documented on parallel forms that fed the same analytical engines. Tech adepts supervised maintenance rituals while recording detailed measurements of ritual compliance, equipment modification, success rates, and unit cohesion metrics using standardized observation protocols that treated Brother Sergeant Voss's bone filing ceremonies and Trooper Caney's contamination monitoring as functionally equivalent data collection opportunities. Servo skulls drifted through cursed formations like mechanical insects, their sensor arrays measuring heart rates, stress hormones, and neural activity during combat operations, while audit cherubs tallied kill-to-loss ratios and psychological breaking points with mathematical precision. Bioreactive tattoos on contaminated soldiers transmitted real-time contamination indices to Project Anathema cogitator banks through encrypted channels that bypassed normal medical reporting structures. Their readings processed alongside genetic aberrant variance assessments through unified algorithms that treated spiritual corruption and genetic instability as interchangeable variables requiring identical analytical treatment. The project's systematic scope revealed itself through documentation spanning 2 decades of cursed soldier deployment, with individual tracking records following soldiers from initial curse manifestation through multiple operational cycles. Cross-referencing exposed deliberate curse cultivation through controlled exposure protocols that mirrored S21 genetic modification procedures in systematic application and calculated outcomes. Contaminated guard units showed exposure patterns too consistent for battlefield coincidence, their contamination events occurring at precisely calculated intervals that provided optimal data collection opportunities while maintaining plausible deniability regarding institutional involvement. Controlled exposure facilities at classified quarantine installations housed condemned personnel undergoing managed contamination procedures calibrated to produce specific curse types with predetermined tactical applications. Genetic modification protocols borrowed from S21 procedures, while contamination chambers replicated battlefield exposure conditions under controlled circumstances that maximize survival rates while ensuring useful curse development. These facilities operated parallel production lines for different curse types using unified administrative frameworks that treated genetic aberration and contamination as alternative manufacturing processes, producing identical strategic outcomes. Project Anathema's stated objective was creating specialized anti-chaos forces from the Imperium's own damned, but internal memoranda revealed broader ambitions encompassing systematic weaponization of human damnation as renewable strategic resource. Deployment algorithms matched curse types to tactical requirements with mathematical precision, treating genetic aberrants and contaminated soldiers as interchangeable assets whose various origins mattered less than their operational effectiveness against specific threats. The Black Dragon's osteoweapons and the Mordian 13th's chaos immunity served identical functions within tactical matrices that reduced theological distinctions to administrative convenience. Administrative convergence became total through unified command structures processing all cursed formations through identical bureaucratic channels despite maintaining fictional separation for theological purposes. Personnel trained in genetic, aberrant observation transferred seamlessly to contamination monitoring because the procedures were functionally equivalent, their expertise applicable across curse types through standardized protocols documented in Technical Manual 88 variant, Form 8841 VAR for genetic aberrants, and Form 8841 CON for contaminated soldiers, shared database architecture, and analytical algorithms because they served identical functions within the broader experimental framework. Most significantly, the documentation revealed that successful cursed units face perpetual deployment rather than redemption because their effectiveness made them too valuable to lose and too dangerous to acknowledge. Victory parameters shifted as completion approached, new objectives emerged from bureaucratic review, and success metrics evolved to maintain permanent operational status regardless of battlefield achievements. The administrative language converted tactical virtue into operational duration, transforming effectiveness into permanent expendability through bureaucratic mechanisms that treated redemption as liability rather than reward. The Data Vault's Black Annex recorded edge cases exposing the system's ultimate cruelty. Cursed formations whose tactical innovation exceeded projections faced systematic degradation through delayed resupply, increased observation, and eventual administrative erasure. One genetic aberrant company showing initiative beyond doctrine received notation Omega Red if divergence persists before disappearing from subsequent records, their gene seed recovery meeting quota, while their tactical innovations vanished into classified archives. Contaminated regiments demonstrating excessive competence faced similar fates, their effectiveness ensuring elimination rather than recognition. Evidence suggested Project Anathema's scope encompassed multiple segmenta through systematic programs coordinating cursed soldier deployment with mathematical precision that treated human damnation as renewable resource rather than theological catastrophe. Deployment statistics revealed thousands of cursed formations operating across 10,000 worlds, their existence denied but essential to Imperial survival through tactical capabilities that Orthodox forces could not replicate. Internal assessments projected expansion of curse cultivation programs to meet increasing demand for specialized forces capable of operating against existential threat that challenged conventional Imperial military doctrine. The revelation recontextualized every aspect of cursed soldier existence as component of systematic experimentation rather than emergency response, exposing how the Imperial bureaucracy had learned to create and deploy human damnation as strategic asset through frameworks that maximize tactical utility while maintaining theological justification. The cracked Aquila badge appeared in observation reports as cultural marker indicating successful cross-curse unit development under systematic exploitation, its passage between formations, tracked through picked captures and cross-referenced with cohesion metrics that reduced shared suffering to administrative data points. Project Anathema proved that cursed soldiers represented deliberate imperial policy rather than unfortunate necessity, their various damnations cultivated and deployed through systematic frameworks that treated genetic aberration and spiritual contamination as interchangeable tactical assets. The sealed data vault provided definitive evidence. The Imperium had learned to weaponize its own damnation with mathematical precision, creating cursed soldiers through controlled processes while denying their humanity through administrative mechanisms that converted tactical success into permanent servitude disguised as theological necessity. How extensive is the deliberate cultivation of cursed soldiers across the Imperium? The documentation suggested systematic programs spanning multiple segmenta, with expansion projected to meet strategic demands that conventional forces could not address. What happens to cursed soldiers who become too effective for their own good? They become too valuable to eliminate and too dangerous to acknowledge, their tactical competence ensuring perpetual deployment through frameworks that transform effectiveness into chains binding them to service without recognition, redemption, or rest. The sealed data vault from Baphomet Gate contained deployment schedules that extended far beyond the battle's conclusion, revealing how Project Anathema's systematic orchestration transformed tactical success into perpetual servitude through bureaucratic mechanisms designed to maximize cursed soldier utility. Brother Sergeant Voss received commendation for exceptional valor alongside transfer orders to the Ghoul Stars, where his bone blade modifications would prove essential against Xenos threats that conventional weapons could not address. Trooper Kaney's contaminated unit earned recognition for corruption resistance while drawing immediate reassignment to the Maelstrom Zone, their chaos immunity making them indispensable for operations in warp-saturated regions where Orthodox forces suffered catastrophic casualties within hours of deployment. The bureaucratic machinery ensuring endless service operated through policy frameworks that converted tactical achievement into permanent obligation disguised as honor. Victory parameters shifted as completion approached through algorithmic updates that arrived with mathematical precision, their timing calculated to ensure successful, cursed formations never achieved the redemption their service supposedly earned. The Lamenters completed Penance Crusade objectives only to receive extended mission parameters, citing exceptional performance requiring continued deployment. Administrative Code 4471 Omega-7 followed successful units, like a shadow stamped into vellum, marking them for escalation rather than relief. Transfer orders revealed systematic design rather than operational necessity, with effective cursed formations rotating through increasingly hazardous assignments that tested the limits of their curse-granted capabilities. Genetic aberrants who survived corruption-dense environments drew deployment to Xenos infiltration zones, where their mutations provided detection advantages Orthodox troops entirely lacked. Contaminated soldiers whose immunity proved effective against specific chaos threats faced assignment to similar corruption types in different sectors, their damnation serving as renewable resource deployed wherever Imperial forces encountered comparable spiritual hazards. This perpetual deployment cycle created shared experiences that transcended original curse types, forging bonds between genetic aberrants and contaminated soldiers through systematic exploitation that affected both classifications equally. Bone-filing liturgies adopted the cadence of contamination checks, with Mordian veterans timing their crystal grinding to Astartes counts, so maintenance decks rang in unison. The pale paste of bone dust or crystalline powder mixed with sacred oils became common sacrament rubbed into bolt actions and scabbed knuckles alike, its gritty texture providing tactile reminder of their shared altered nature. Morning inspection rituals followed identical patterns regardless of curse type, with genetic aberrants filing bone growths while contaminated soldiers checked bioreactive tattoos through procedures that served the same administrative requirements. Evening maintenance combined different curse types in informal groups that exchange survival strategies, contraband hymns, and improvised equipment modifications designed to maximize effectiveness while minimizing administrative attention. They learned to stage compliance for servo skull observation while conducting real maintenance according to their own survival-focused protocols. The cracked Aquila badge evolved from individual talisman into network identifier connecting cursed formations across multiple sectors through communication channels that bypassed official command structures. Veterans from different curse types recognized the badge's significance immediately, its fracture line marking shared understanding of systematic exploitation that transcended theological distinctions between genetic aberration and contamination. Network waypoints emerged with the consistency of star charts, rusted pilgrim chapels 2 decks down from main transit, where incense masked the smell of solvent and old blood, medici bays with cracked blue tiles where sympathetic tech adepts would sign fitness forms before hands stopped shaking, quartermasters who stocked incorrect ammunition calibers on paper but maintained crates marked devotional objects that rattled like proper munitions. These markers passed mouth to mouth, aquila to aquila, creating infrastructure for mutual survival that existed parallel to official channels. Veteran cursed soldiers developed expertise that transcended their original curse classifications, becoming specialists in corruption warfare whose tactical knowledge proved indispensable for training new formations and adapting to emerging threats. Brother Sergeant Voss's decades of voidboarding experience made him invaluable for instructing both genetic aberrants and contaminated soldiers in close quarters combat techniques adapted for aberrant physiology. Imperial dependency on cursed soldier capabilities reached critical thresholds through operational requirements that conventional forces could not address effectively. Fleet captains filed requests for variant-compatible assets when routes cut through plague tides. Planetary governors delayed exterminatus protocols because cursed detachments could thread needles where orbital torpedoes only made noise. The Imperium condemned the tool in public while reaching for it in private because nothing else worked as consistently or economically. The longer soldiers lived under anathema's arithmetic, the less redemption resembled an achievable outcome. Veterans with decades of service understood that their effectiveness guaranteed perpetual deployment, their tactical value ensuring continued exploitation through administrative mechanisms that converted virtue into liability. They stopped writing petitions for clemency and started maintaining ledgers, tracking who owed what, where favors could be called, and how to secure wounded brothers onto transport ships that would actually depart. This shift from seeking redemption to planning survival marked fundamental transformation in cursed soldier psychology. When cursed soldiers stopped seeking redemption and started planning for survival, they crossed a threshold that challenged the system's fundamental assumptions. The Imperium's dependency on forces it could not officially acknowledge created strategic vulnerability that grew with each successful operation, fostering silent schism between official narrative and brutal reality where survival hinged on continued exploitation of soldiers who increasingly viewed their damnation as evolution rather than punishment. The perpetual deployment cycles that emerged from Project Anathema's systematic orchestration inevitably produced formations whose service transcended mere decades, creating cohorts of soldiers whose accumulated experience spans centuries of continuous warfare. These eternal penitents represent the logical endpoint of cursed soldier exploitation, formations whose effectiveness has made elimination impossible, while their accumulated expertise challenges every assumption underlying Imperial doctrine. Brother Ancient Karax of the Black Dragons, Ninth Company, has operated continuously for 317 years without returning to his homeworld, his bone modifications so extensive that his original skeletal structure exists only as calcium framework, supporting layers of weaponized growth that transform him into something barely recognizable as human, yet undeniably loyal to Imperial survival. The physical transformation these veterans undergo defies both medical understanding and theological categorization. Carax's osteoblades have evolved beyond S21 parameters into configurations that provide tactical advantages no genetic engineer anticipated, their growth patterns adapted through centuries of combat into living weapons that require specialized maintenance tools crafted from materials existing nowhere in standard Imperial supply chains. His morning filing ritual has transformed from concealment necessity into precision maintenance, each stroke calibrated for optimal cutting angles rather than administrative compliance. The bone dust he produces incorporates trace elements from Xenos blood and Daemon ichor, creating paste that provides equipment lubrication properties that exceed anything available through orthodox supply channels. Sergeant Major Veron of the Mordian 88th Penal Regiment traces his contaminated lineage through 4 centuries of continuous deployment, his unit designation surviving complete personnel turnover 17 times, while maintaining institutional memory through veterans whose service records predate most planetary governors. His contamination indices display colors that exist outside standard classification systems, their patterns indicating exposure levels that should have resulted in immediate execution, yet instead grant immunity to corruption types that devastate conventional forces. The crystalline growths erupting from his chaos-scarred flesh require filing procedures identical to genetic aberrant maintenance, producing mineral powder that serves the same equipment enhancement functions as bone dust through convergent evolution of curse management techniques. These eternal formations have developed autonomous capabilities that operate independently of Imperial command structures while maintaining strategic alignment with Imperial objectives. The informal networks that began as survival mechanisms have evolved into sophisticated infrastructure, supporting cursed soldier operations across vast distances through channels that bypass official oversight entirely. The cracked Aquila badge serves as authentication token for encrypted Vox frequencies, carrying tactical intelligence between cursed formations across multiple segmenta, their transmissions using codes developed independently of Imperial cryptographic systems through accumulated wisdom from centuries of institutional neglect. Waypoint systems have crystallized into permanent infrastructure known only to veterans whose service spans decades. Hidden supply caches contain equipment modifications that exist nowhere in official technical manuals, their specifications developed through trial and error by soldiers whose survival depends on capabilities that orthodox doctrine cannot provide. Maintenance facilities operate in forgotten sections of Imperial infrastructure, staffed by tech adepts and medicae whose expertise in cursed soldier support exceeds anything available through official channels. A pilgrim chapel with brass candlestick concealing data stick cores, medici bays with cracked tiles hiding instruction caches, maintenance lockers scented with citrus solvent, where sympathetic tech adepts leave supply notifications coded in wire knots that mean ammunition shortages or shield blessing requirements. Most significantly, these eternal penitents have developed field doctrine that transcends their original curse classifications through centuries of joint operations and shared survival necessity. Brother Ancient Carax instructs mixed cadres in voidboarding techniques that combine genetic aberrant capabilities with contaminated soldier procedures, his methods proving more effective than orthodox Space Marine doctrine against corruption-based threats. Sergeant Major Veron trains new contaminated formations using procedures that integrate genetic aberrant concealment techniques with contamination management protocols, his expertise demonstrating that different curse types serve identical tactical functions through unified administrative frameworks. The theological crisis emerges from their fundamental transformation in purpose and identity. These veterans no longer seek spiritual cleansing through sacrifice, but have found meaning in their damnation as specialists whose capabilities serve Imperial survival more effectively than orthodox forces. They speak of their curses as evolutionary advantages rather than spiritual burdens, their perpetual deployment as chosen service rather than imposed punishment. Brother Ancient Karax refers to his bone modifications as gifts, enabling him to protect Imperial citizens more effectively than standard Astartes physiology would allow. Sergeant Major Varen describes his contamination as immunization, permitting operations in environments where Orthodox soldiers die within minutes of exposure. This transformation from seeking redemption to embracing purpose creates autonomous doctrine that challenges Imperial theological foundations while serving Imperial strategic interests. The field catechism these veterans have compiled contains procedures named for functions rather than saints, rite of pale mixture, canticle of the fifth count, litany against drifting floors. Their cracked aquila serves as colophon marking texts belonging to what they call the Aquila line, the informal network exchanging survival knowledge outside command channels. They no longer promise redemption to new cadres but offer technique, their prayers acquiring extra lines requesting that deaths fall in gaps that need them rather than ones that flatter reports. The administrative machinery that created these eternal formations through systematic exploitation faces the consequences of its success. Cursed soldiers whose expertise exceeds official doctrine, whose capabilities surpass orthodox forces, whose networks operate independently of Imperial command structures, yet whose loyalty serves Imperial objectives while rejecting Imperial theology. Files marked Omega Red appear with increasing frequency as the system recognizes that its most effective assets have developed beyond administrative control, yet elimination remains impossible because their capabilities have become essential to Imperial survival across multiple sectors. Evidence suggests these eternal formations represent the future of cursed soldier service, their independence providing templates for autonomous capability that serves Imperial interests while operating outside Imperial doctrine. New cursed formations increasingly adopt procedures developed by eternal veterans rather than official protocols, their effectiveness proving superior to orthodox methods while creating networks that bypass administrative oversight. Fleet captains request variant-compatible advisors through unofficial channels when routes traverse corruption zones. Planetary commanders delay exterminatus protocols because cursed detachments identify solutions that orbital bombardment cannot provide, and Ordo agents consult off-record regarding threats that conventional forces cannot assess effectively. The transformation reveals systematic vulnerability in Imperial strategic planning. The Imperium has become dependent on forces it cannot officially acknowledge, their effectiveness essential to survival, while their independence threatens doctrinal control. Brother Ancient Karax files his bone modifications each morning, not as penance, but as preparation. Sergeant Major Varen monitors contamination indices not as burden, but as tactical advantage, and the cracked Aquila badge passes between formations that have learned to see their curses as capabilities rather than punishments, their endurance as evolution rather than suffering, their service as chosen purpose rather than imposed obligation. What happens when cursed soldiers develop their own doctrine independent of Imperial oversight? They become more effective than orthodox forces while maintaining strategic alignment through practical necessity rather than administrative compulsion, their expertise serving Imperial survival through capabilities that official doctrine cannot replicate or control. Are centuries-old cursed veterans still seeking redemption, or have they transcended the need for it? They have discovered purpose in damnation that surpasses the spiritual purity they were taught to desire, their service motivated by practical effectiveness rather than theological obligation, their loyalty earned through mutual benefit rather than imposed through systematic exploitation. The eternal penitents represent the system's greatest success and its ultimate vulnerability, forces whose effectiveness has made them indispensable, while their independence challenges the fundamental premises of imperial cursed soldier doctrine. The independence that eternal penitents had cultivated through centuries of service triggered the imperial bureaucracy's ultimate response. Protocol Omega, a systematic erasure program that operated with the same mathematical precision that had created cursed soldiers in the first place. Brother Ancient Carex discovered its existence when requisitions for specialized bone filing tools received responses indicating his formation no longer existed in official records, despite active deployment orders requiring his expertise against Xenos infiltration. The administrative machinery had learned to eliminate cursed formations through bureaucratic assassination, erasing them from imperial documentation while they continued fighting, their effectiveness ensuring continued deployment, while their independence guaranteed eventual elimination. Administrative erasure began with polite efficiency that concealed deliberate betrayal behind routine clerical procedures. Supply manifests developed selective amnesia regarding formations marked for elimination, their requisitions lost in processing, while ammunition and medical supplies vanished into bureaucratic void. Vox frequencies experienced systematic interference that prevented communication with imperial command structures, while maintaining internal unit cohesion necessary for tactical effectiveness. Muster rolls were backdated to reflect losses that had not occurred. Astropathic sigils tied to units were reassigned to depot addresses that did not exist, and gene seed caskets flagged for recovery were routed to reliquary vaults that never returned anything they received. Protocol Omega operated identically for genetic aberrants and contaminated soldiers despite their different origins, revealing administrative convergence that treated various curse types as equivalent threats requiring identical elimination protocols. Brother Ancient Carex's Black Dragons received deployment orders signed with seals that existed nowhere in Imperial heraldry databases, while Sergeant Major Veron's contaminated regiment drew assignments from commanders whose authority could not be verified through official channels. Both formations faced the same systematic isolation, transport delays that stranded them in hostile zones, medical evacuation that never arrived, reinforcement promises that dissolved into administrative confusion when casualties mounted beyond sustainable levels. The Eternal Veterans recognized these patterns through accumulated experience that transcended individual curse classifications, their centuries of service providing institutional memory regarding imperial betrayal techniques that newer formations lacked. Hidden supply caches expanded into survival networks containing equipment modifications that existed nowhere in official technical manuals. Their specifications developed through necessity by soldiers who understood their effectiveness guaranteed elimination rather than reward. Tech adepts and Medicae, whose loyalty belonged to formations rather than institutions, began providing maintenance and medical support independent of imperial supply chains, their service motivated by practical effectiveness rather than theological obligation. The cracked Aquila badge transformed from informal talisman into authentication token for encrypted frequencies carrying intelligence regarding Protocol Omega implementation, its fracture line marking the space between official loyalty and survival necessity. Veterans learned to recognize erasure indicators through systematic observation, supply delays following specific patterns, Vox interference at calculated intervals, deployment orders containing administrative codes that appeared nowhere in standard imperial documentation. The badge was slipped into gauntlets and pockets as silent warning when orders tasted of ash passed between formations marked for elimination as symbol of shared abandonment and quiet resistance. Cursed formations began preparing for Imperial betrayal through contingency planning that blurred the distinction between loyalty and heresy, their survival strategies requiring capabilities that challenged fundamental assumptions underlying Imperial doctrine. Hidden facilities provided maintenance support staffed by personnel whose expertise in cursed soldier requirements exceeded anything available through official channels. Communication networks evolved beyond information sharing into active resistance infrastructure that operated independently of Imperial oversight while maintaining strategic alignment through practical necessity rather than administrative compulsion. The theological crisis emerged from impossible loyalty calculations. How do soldiers remain faithful to an Imperium preparing to erase them? The answer required redefinition of loyalty itself, shifting from blind obedience to abstract Imperial concepts toward fierce dedication to humanity's practical survival, often achieved by operating outside the very doctrines designed to protect it. Brother Ancient Karax no longer sought to atone for inherited sin, but to hone his osteoblades into ever more effective weapons for humanity's defense. Sergeant Major Veren focused on leveraging his contamination for tactical advantage rather than striving for spiritual cleansing, becoming a living shield against warp-spawned horrors. What emerged when cursed soldiers prioritized survival over redemption was a shadow military operating within Imperial borders but increasingly detached from direct control. These formations continued fighting the Imperium's wars while also fighting for their own right to exist, their survival becoming quiet rebellion against systematic consumption. Veterans understood that their effectiveness had become their death sentence, that their loyalty served an institution preparing to eliminate them, yet they maintained service through understanding that their weapons protected Imperial citizens rather than Imperial institutions. Protocol Omega's implementation created feedback loops that accelerated cursed soldier independence through systematic betrayal that forced autonomous capability development. The cracked Aquila badge passed between formations that increasingly viewed their service as chosen purpose rather than imposed obligation, their network serving Imperial interests while operating outside Imperial control. How do soldiers remain loyal to an Imperium preparing to erase them? Through loyalty directed toward strategic objectives rather than administrative authorities whose betrayal had become systematic policy. What emerges when cursed soldiers prioritize survival over redemption? Networks that serve Imperial survival through practical necessity rather than doctrinal compulsion, their independence representing evolution in service that transcends the theological frameworks designed to ensure their systematic exploitation and eventual elimination. The resistance networks that emerged from Protocol Omega's systematic betrayal exposed the ultimate truth that Imperial doctrine had concealed behind centuries of theological complexity and administrative compartmentalization. Genetic aberration and contamination were not tragic necessities requiring management, but deliberate policy decisions designed to create expendable specialists through different methodologies serving identical strategic objectives. The evidence that Brother Ancient Karax and Sergeant Major Veren had accumulated through their survival networks revealed the fundamental reframe that challenged every assumption underlying Imperial purity doctrine. Their different curses represented twin aspects of the same program, convergent outcomes of unified strategic planning that had always treated various forms of useful damnation as interchangeable assets. The sealed archives recovered from Protocol Omega facilities contained documentation proving systematic coordination between genetic modification programs and contamination protocols from their inception. Directive S-21's authorization in 738 and 41 coincided with preliminary studies examining contaminated soldier effectiveness, their parallel development indicating unified strategic planning rather than separate responses to different crises. Internal memoranda revealed that Magos Biologis Verenkout supervised both genetic aberrant trials and contamination assessment procedures through identical research methodologies, his personnel transferring seamlessly between programs because the underlying science treated genetic instability and spiritual corruption as variable inputs requiring equivalent analytical treatment. The administrative merger became total through bureaucratic frameworks that processed all cursed formations through identical channels despite maintaining the theological fiction of separate treatment. Form 8841 VAR for genetic aberrants and Form 8841 CON for contaminated soldiers shared database architecture, analytical algorithms, and reporting structures because they served equivalent functions within the broader experimental framework. The administrative code 4471 Omega-7 that appeared on both Brother Sergeant Voss's deployment orders and Trooper Caney's contamination assessments was not coincidence but deliberate identifier for expendable assets with strategic utility, regardless of curse origin. Personnel trained in genetic aberrant management transferred directly to contamination oversight through standardized procedures documented in Technical Manual 88 variant, their expertise applicable across curse types because the underlying administrative logic treated different forms of damnation as interchangeable variables. Project Anathema represented the operational synthesis of these parallel research streams, coordinating deployment of genetic aberrants and contaminated soldiers through unified command structures that treated their different origins as administrative convenience rather than tactical necessity. The project's classified objectives revealed systematic weaponization of human damnation as renewable strategic resource, with genetic trials and contamination protocols serving as alternative manufacturing processes producing identical tactical outcomes. Cost-benefit analyses compared genetic modification expenses against contamination, cultivation costs, treating human suffering as acceptable overhead in strategic planning equations that reduced theological complexity to bureaucratic convenience. Cursed soldier culture evolved beyond original curse classifications through shared experience of systematic exploitation that affected genetic aberrants and contaminated formations equally. The morning rituals that began as separate concealment procedures converged into unified maintenance practices serving identical administrative requirements. Brother Ancient Karax's bone filing ceremonies and Sergeant Major Veren's contamination checks followed parallel patterns because they addressed the same institutional demands for curse management through standardized protocols. The pale paste, produced from bone dust or crystalline powder, served equivalent equipment enhancement functions, because both curse types required identical tactical support through convergent evolution of survival techniques that transcended their different origins. The cracked Aquila badge represented cultural synthesis transcending theological distinctions between genetic aberration and contamination, its passage between formations marking shared understanding of systematic betrayal that unified cursed soldiers regardless of their origins in faith or genetics. Veterans recognized the badge's significance immediately because their accumulated experience revealed identical treatment through administrative frameworks that reduced theological complexity to bureaucratic convenience. The fracture line marked the space between official doctrine and operational reality, between imperial claims of purity and systematic cultivation of useful damnation through controlled processes disguised as emergency responses to unfortunate circumstances. The theological implications proved staggering in their systematic scope and calculated cynicism. The Imperium had deliberately created its own form of controlled heresy through programs that violated every principle of purity doctrine while serving strategic objectives that conventional forces could not achieve. Genetic trials produced Space Marines whose mutations challenged Imperial human identity while providing tactical advantages against specific threats. Contamination protocols created soldiers whose spiritual scarring contradicted Imperial theological foundations while granting immunity to corruption effects that devastated Orthodox formations. Both programs operated through unified frameworks that treated human damnation as renewable resource rather than theological catastrophe, their success measured in strategic capability rather than spiritual purity. Most significantly, cursed soldiers had developed autonomous capabilities that served Imperial strategic interests while operating outside Imperial doctrinal control, their effectiveness proving superior to orthodox methods through practical necessity rather than theological justification. The field doctrine they compiled contained procedures that combined genetic aberrant techniques with contaminated soldier methods, their unified approach demonstrating that different curse types served equivalent tactical functions through convergent evolution of survival strategies. These formations continued fighting Imperial wars while developing independence that challenged fundamental assumptions underlying cursed soldier management, their loyalty directed toward strategic objectives rather than administrative authorities whose betrayal had become systematic policy. The synthesis revealed that curses were not flaws requiring management, but features designed to provide tactical capabilities that Orthodox forces lacked, their systematic cultivation representing deliberate Imperial policy disguised as emergency response to unfortunate circumstances. Brother Ancient Carax's bone modifications served strategic objectives that conventional space marine physiology could not achieve, his genetic instability providing advantages that justified systematic exploitation through perpetual deployment. Sergeant Major Veren's contamination granted immunity to corruption effects that incapacitated Orthodox troops, his spiritual scarring serving tactical functions that required continued exposure to threats that would destroy uncontaminated formations. The administrative evidence proved conclusively that genetic trials and contamination protocols were twin aspects of a unified program designed to create expendable specialists through different methodologies serving identical strategic objectives. The Imperium had learned to weaponize its own damnation with mathematical precision, creating cursed soldiers through controlled processes while denying their humanity through administrative mechanisms that converted tactical success into permanent servitude disguised as theological necessity. The system operated through calculated exploitation of useful damnation as renewable strategic resource, treating human suffering as acceptable cost for tactical advantages that conventional doctrine could not provide. Protocol Omega's systematic erasure represented the logical endpoint of this calculated exploitation, eliminating cursed formations when their effectiveness made them too valuable to lose and too dangerous to acknowledge. The protocol operated identically for genetic aberrants and contaminated soldiers because administrative frameworks treated various curse types as equivalent threats requiring identical elimination procedures, their different origins mattering less than their shared capacity for independent action that challenged doctrinal control. The fundamental questions emerged with stark clarity from this synthesis of evidence and experience. If curses are policy, what does that mean for Imperial claims of purity and righteousness? The evidence suggested systematic hypocrisy that violated every principle underlying Imperial identity while serving strategic objectives essential to Imperial survival. The Imperium's righteousness had become performance art, its purity a selective application designed to control narrative, while military necessity dictated far darker reality. Can a system that deliberately creates damnation still call itself righteous? The question challenged fundamental assumptions regarding Imperial moral authority, revealing institutional logic that prioritized tactical effectiveness over theological consistency through frameworks that treated human damnation as acceptable cost for strategic advantage. The cracked Aquila badge passed between formations that increasingly viewed their curses as capabilities rather than punishments, their service as chosen purpose rather than imposed obligation, their loyalty directed toward humanity's practical survival rather than abstract imperial concepts that had proven systematically false through centuries of calculated betrayal. Brother Ancient Carax filed his bone spurs each morning while understanding that his modifications served strategic objectives that justified his systematic exploitation. Sergeant Major Verin monitored contamination indices while recognizing that his scarring provided tactical advantages that ensured his perpetual deployment. They represented the physical manifestation of imperial contradiction, forces whose effectiveness proved essential to survival while their existence challenged every claim regarding righteousness, soldiers whose damnation had become the Imperium's salvation and whose loyalty transcended the institutions that had created and betrayed them. The synthesis that revealed curse as policy rather than tragedy has crystallized into its inevitable conclusion across 10,000 worlds, where millions of cursed soldiers serve in conflicts too dangerous for orthodox troops, their existence systematically denied while remaining essential to imperial survival. The administrative machinery that created Brother Ancient Carax through genetic modification and Sergeant Major Verin through controlled contamination continues its relentless operation, processing new formations through identical bureaucratic channels that reduce theological distinctions to administrative convenience while maximizing tactical utility through calculated exploitation of useful damnation. Brother Ancient Carax performs his morning bone-filing ritual aboard strike cruiser Lamentable, his osteo blade modifications now extending far beyond S-21 parameters into configurations that provide tactical advantages no genetic engineer anticipated. His 3 centuries of continuous deployment have transformed understanding of service from seeking redemption for inherited sin to accepting responsibility for capabilities that protect imperial citizens through methods that orthodox doctrine cannot replicate. The bone dust he produces incorporates trace elements from enemies defeated across multiple sectors, creating paste that enhances equipment performance beyond anything available through standard supply chains, while serving as physical reminder of accumulated expertise that transcends administrative classification. Sergeant Major Verin continues his contamination monitoring aboard transport vessel Penitent's March, his bioreactive tattoos displaying colors that exist outside standard classification systems, yet indicate immunity to corruption effects that devastate conventional formations within minutes of exposure. His 4 centuries of service have evolved understanding of duty from pursuing spiritual cleansing through sacrifice to embracing tactical utility that enables operations in environments where orthodox soldiers die before achieving strategic objectives. The crystalline powder he files serves identical equipment enhancement functions as genetic aberrant bone dust, their convergent evolution demonstrating practical unity that transcends theological distinctions between different curse origins. Across the galaxy, cursed formations have developed autonomous understanding of service that operates independently of imperial doctrine while serving imperial strategic interests through practical necessity rather than administrative compulsion. In the mirror-bright corridors of quarantine barges above plague worlds, black dragons breach corrupted vessels using bone blade techniques perfected through centuries of void warfare. In ash-covered trenches where the air tastes of warp stink and broken prayers, contaminated guard regiments hold positions that would shatter orthodox formations within hours. In hive warrens where children huddle behind makeshift barricades, lamenters accept impossible odds while calculating casualty projections with the same clinical precision Brother Sergeant Voss applies to filing his aberrant growths. The cracked Aquila badge appears openly on webbing and pauldrons, its fracture line no longer concealed but displayed as symbol of shared purpose that transcends curse classification. Veterans from different formations recognize its significance immediately. The damaged Imperial Eagle marking networks that operate beyond official oversight while maintaining strategic alignment through understanding that their weapons protect Imperial citizens rather than Imperial institutions whose betrayal has become systematic policy. Tech adepts with hexagrammic ash on their cuffs provide maintenance support through informal channels. Quartermasters saved during evacuations sign supply chits that clatter like proper ammunition, and medici file fitness reports to satisfy distant clerks while providing real medical care through procedures documented nowhere in official manuals. From centuries of systematic exploitation and calculated betrayal, these eternal servants have compiled their own understanding of duty through accumulated experience that spans continuous warfare against enemies conventional forces cannot effectively engage. They train new arrivals using procedures that combine genetic aberrant techniques with contaminated soldier methods, their field doctrine proving superior to orthodox approaches while requiring capabilities that challenge fundamental assumptions underlying Imperial human identity. The manual they teach carries no official designation, but spreads through networks marked by the cracked Aquila badge, its lessons procedural and impersonal, yet carrying the weight of accumulated survival wisdom. Count to 5 on the file, count to 10 on the breath. Share the pace, not stories, until after the breach. Never trust quiet Auspex readings in corrupted zones. Keep one badge for the living and one for the dead. The instructions blend technical procedure with spiritual necessity, their efficiency masking prayers that have learned to prioritize outcomes over offices, people over paperwork, survival over sanctity. What emerges from this crucible is understanding that transcends both genetic aberration and contamination through shared experience of systematic exploitation disguised as theological necessity. They no longer seek recognition for sacrifices or reward for effectiveness, understanding that their value ensures continued deployment through perpetual assignments that convert tactical success into permanent servitude. Their loyalty has evolved beyond blind obedience toward fierce dedication to humanity's practical survival, often achieved through methods that violate the very doctrines designed to protect it. The procedural creed they recite during maintenance rituals encapsulates this transformation. Words spoken while bone dust and crystalline powder serve identical functions during deployment briefings where different curse types receive equivalent assignments, during casualty processing where various forms of damnation meet identical administrative treatment despite different theological justifications. We are the weapons they need and the sins they deny. We serve not for redemption, but for duty. We are cursed, and we endure. The final image mirrors the opening, but with understanding that transforms its meaning completely. On windless docks under broken skies, new cursed soldiers board transports with packs that smell of oil and ash and iron dust. Brother Sergeant Voss draws his combat blade across fresh bone spurs, while Trooper Kane checks bioreactive tattoos for morning color shifts, both performing rituals that serve identical administrative requirements through different theological justifications. They touch the cracked Aquila badge, now openly theirs, understanding they are not merely being sent to die, but to become something the Imperium requires but cannot admit. Specialized weapons whose various damnations provide tactical capabilities that orthodox forces lack, whose accumulated expertise serves strategic objectives that conventional doctrine cannot achieve, whose loyalty transcends the institutions that created and betrayed them through service directed toward humanity's survival rather than imperial abstractions that have proven systematically false. They board transports knowing their effectiveness guarantees perpetual deployment, their tactical value ensuring continued exploitation through frameworks that convert virtue into liability while their understanding of purpose transforms systematic betrayal into chosen service. We are the weapons they need and the sins they deny. We serve not for redemption, but for duty. We are cursed and we endure.